First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for staying. It's not so easy to sit during a Ta'anit. It's easier to speak, believe it or not. So I appreciate everyone's desire to hear more. I want to thank the previous Rabbanim who spoke also. Just the inspiration being offered today is something really special. And it's I'm extremely inspired by it. I have in front of me a document that dates back to an order that was given from Berlin to the Gestapo in the year 1940. And the document actually was given to the chief of the German occupation power in Poland and was given to the Central Office of the German Security Forces. It was called the SS. It's a document that the Germans in Poland were instructed to be very careful not to allow Ostjuden to leave. Ostjuden means the Jews from the east, from Poland. They're Jews from the Western European countries, Germany and France, Switzerland, places like that. And they're Jews from Eastern Europe, especially Poland. The Nazis were given a special communique to do everything in their power not to let East European Jews leave. Apparently at that point in 1940, there was still a limited amount of exit visas, and the Germans had an opportunity to give them to certain people, but they were instructed the Jews from Eastern Europe, do not let them leave. The reason why, it says in this communication, is because of the Orthodox Einstellung, because of their Orthodox way of life. Apparently the Jews in Eastern Europe, we know, held very much on to Torah. And the Nazis wrote, because they hold on to the Orthodox Einstellung, because they hold on to their orthodoxy, to their Torah, these Ostjuden would provide the Rabbiner and Talmud lehrer. From these people will come the rabbis and the teachers of Talmud. That was a Nazi communique in 1940. Don't let the rabbis leave. Don't let the teachers of Talmud leave. Because, and he continues, it's from the rabbis and teachers of Talmud who will create a completely new spiritual regeneration of the Jews in America. That's what the Nazis said. Don't let the rabbis leave. Don't let the teachers of Talmud leave. Because with them, they'll keep Judaism alive. How interesting it is that sometimes our enemies know better than we do where the heart of Judaism lives. It lives with those who know the Torah and teach the Torah. Sometimes we forget it. But our enemies sometimes have to remind us of it. I want to give a short talk today about a topic which has bothered me for many years, especially when I was in high school, a teenager. I was very bothered why the Jews in Europe during the Holocaust never resisted. Why didn't they fight back? Certainly there were situations where we outnumbered the Germans in many, many thousands against a relatively few. And yet there were only few cases where there was physical rebellion. The Warsaw Ghetto was definitely one of them. It was a very gallant attempt and something very heroic. But why weren't there more like that? And that bothered me a lot when I was younger. With maturity, I realized the question really wasn't a question because it was very difficult to rebel. When someone stands before a family with a machine gun and says that, the whole family will die if anyone does anything, it's a very difficult choice to say a person's going to fight. And even on railroad tracks and things like this, where a person might have been successful in killing one Nazi, but everyone understood that they would open up with guns and machine guns, and there the blood would be flowing. So it was a very difficult choice, and it wasn't easy. And of course the Nazis were masters at propaganda, and they would trick us to the last moment. Even as we came into Auschwitz, concentration camps, they would say, put your luggage over here, you'll be getting it later. We had people write postcards back from the camp saying everything is fine. We didn't believe it to the last minute either. It's not the Jewish way to believe such horror. About 20 years ago, I remember a new set of literature began to appear in the market, in the Jewish bookstores. And it was a literature that pointed to what I feel is the real heroism of the Holocaust. It wasn't a heroism of fighting back with guns. It was a heroism of something we call spiritual heroism. Fighting back in a way in which a person maintains who he is and what he believes no matter what happens. And I dare say that that type of heroism is even a deeper heroism and maybe a greater heroism. I read once that after the war in 1945, Mike Tress, a great American activist, went over to Europe, and he was in the displaced person camps. And in the camp, he met a Hasidic Jew. And what was interesting about this Jew in 1945, and it doesn't sound so startling saying it in 2011, but in 1945, this Jew had a beard. And the beard was a beard that took many years to grow. And everybody knew that if one survived the war in Europe, it was impossible to do it with a beard. Either the Nazis forcibly shaved us in the concentration camps, or if a person was fighting with the partisans, or fighting in any unit, he had to shave his beard. If he was hiding, he had to look like a non-Jew. Therefore, for a Jew of this person to have such a beard like this, it was unusual and remarkable. Mike Tress looked at him and said, I just have one question. How'd you keep the beard? So this gentleman said to him, he said, Ich bin ein Partisan. I'm a partisan. Partisan. So Mike Tress said to him, you're a partisan. Are you fought in the forests? He said, no. He said, you were a part of some paramilitary group that was blowing up railroad tracks? He said, no. He said, you were hiding in the city, doing something underground? He said, no. He said, what do you mean you were a partisan? He said, there are many different types of partisans. Sometimes a person fights with a gun. I fought with my beard. No matter where I was, no matter what happened to me, I was committed that I would not shave my beard. I would look like a Jew no matter what happened. How he did it, I do not know, but he succeeded. There are many ways to fight. Are we going to be Jewish? Are we going to live like Jews in the most difficult situation? I dare say, if a Jew can do that, there's a heroism in that which is beyond anything that we can imagine. The Talmud tells us there are 3 traits that exemplify a Jew. And in fact, if you meet a Jew and he claims to be a Jew and he doesn't have these 3 traits, you have to question whether he's really Jewish. The traits are Rachmanut, mercy, Baishanut, which means shame, a sense of his dignity, a sense of feeling bad about things, and Gomel Chasadim, a Gomel Chasadim, someone who wants to do, somebody who wants to give. A person who doesn't have those traits, you meet somebody and he doesn't have compassion and kindness and shame, you have to question, is he Mezerah Abraham? I dare say that sometimes Hashem needs to test us in order to bring those traits out from who we are. Sometimes those qualities can be colored and covered by the society that we live in. But Hashem has to squeeze us sometimes in order to see, do we have those qualities? Going back in my own life, around 30 years ago, I was asked by some friends in Jerusalem to go up north to visit a husband and wife who were known to be miracle workers. A husband and wife who had survived the Holocaust, who lived in a one-room house with a dirt floor, and people come from all over the world to get blessings from them. So I said, sure. I had no idea who they were. So I remember we went in a van and we drove up north to a little town, a little farm. And we got to this farm, and there in fact was a dirt hut and a wooden floor. Two very happy people in front of the hut with big smiles. And I looked down the road, there were a whole line of sports cars. People had flown in from London and Brussels, other parts of Europe, to get blessings and advice from these two people. And I went in, and I remember this individual kissed me on my right shoulder, which I was always wondering what that was all about. And we spoke, and I left feeling these are very, very special people. And the experience always stayed in the back of my mind for many, many years. But I had no way of tracing it. I didn't remember the people I'd gone up there with. About 6 years ago, I was walking past a store in Jerusalem, and I saw a book that had just come on the marketplace. And it was a book entitled The Holy Woman. And I don't know why, but my eye went towards the book, and I opened it up. And I saw some pictures. I looked at the pictures, and I saw that was the woman, and that was her husband. And I started reading. Turns out, he was from Hungary. He went through the hell of concentration camps. He survived the war, came to Jerusalem. She was, in fact, one of the victims of Mengele, the doctor in Auschwitz who took people for operations to see if they could survive without anesthesia. Transplants. In fact, a lot of we know about how long pilots will survive in freezing cold water is based on these experiments that these so-called people did. She was one of his victims. She made it to Jerusalem. She ended up meeting this tzaddik. His name was Moshe Kramer. His name was Chayesar Kramer. They married. She was unable to have children due to the fact that Mengele, in one of his operations, completely undid her insides. But instead, they brought people into their home. People who were so disabled and so disadvantaged and so in need of help that families didn't want these children. But they took them in, sometimes 5 and 6 at a time, and cared for them and raised them. So I was reading the book a little further. I found out why he kissed everybody on the right shoulder. I was expecting a Kabbalistic reason. It was not. He used to kiss everybody on the cheek, but his wife said it wasn't sanitary, so he started kissing on the shoulder. But what fascinated me was the introduction. The author of this book was a woman who had found Judaism later in life and had searched through all sorts of Eastern religions, spent time in ashram. And she came to Jerusalem to complete her search. Didn't know it was the beginning of her search, really. And someone suggested that she meet this woman, Chayesar Kramer, and she did. And she went up to where she lived up north. And they were sitting across the table from each other. And she said to her, listen, can I ask you something personal? She said, sure. Ask me whatever you want. She said, I know you were in Auschwitz. The Holocaust was always so much a part of my life and so important to me, and I've always wanted to understand it. Can you tell me what Auschwitz was like? So this woman, Chayesar Kramer, who'd been operated on by Mengele, looks at her, says, Auschwitz? It wasn't so bad. And the author of this book, Ms. Rigler, she looks at Chayesar Kramer and she says, don't give me any of this religious garbage. Auschwitz was a horror. It was terrible. How could you claim it wasn't so bad? So this woman said, we were picked up in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. In the cattle car, we managed to stay together, myself and a bunch of religious girls from my hometown. While we were still on the way, we said to each other that no matter what, we're going to live for each other. We're going to make sure that anyone in need will have. And that's what we did. If a girl was sick, we'd sacrifice our bread portion. One girl had memorized the whole Rosh Hashanah davening. On Rosh Hashanah, we stood next to her and she davened for all of us. Another girl somehow had smuggled in a portion of the Megillat Esther. On Purim, she read it to us all. We lived for each other, she said. You, on the other hand, you spent the last 10 years studying in an Indian ashram. That was all about you. If you're in a place where you can give, it's good. If you're in a place where it's all about you, that's a bad place. You are in a bad place. When the author of this book heard this, she writes that her head was turned around 180 degrees. The definition of good, the definition of bad, was completely altered. Goodness means that you have the opportunity to give, to grow, to be like the Almighty. Bad means you're in a situation where it's all about you. My friends, sometimes the Ribbono Shel Olam has to squeeze us in a way that the real Jew has to come out. What is the real Jew? Compassion, kindness, shame. I once asked my father-in-law a question. My father-in-law is from Czechoslovakia, and he was picked up by the Nazis when he was hiding in Hungary. He was deported to Auschwitz. From Auschwitz, he was sent to Mauthausen. Mauthausen was a death camp where they worked you to death in Austria. I once asked him a question, what was it like at liberation? Finally, when you were liberated from that hell, what was it like? So I remember the first thing he told me was that where he was, they were liberated by the Americans. When the Americans came in with trucks, he said it was the first time he ever saw black. Apparently, Europe didn't have blacks in those days. The American army did. Then I asked him, I said, what happened to the Nazi guards on liberation? He said they put on civilian clothing and they vanished into the local villages as if nothing happened. I said, what did the prisoners do? He said the prisoners went after them. It's before the Americans were able to fully establish control in the camps. I said, did they catch any? He said, yes. In fact, they went into these villages, they were identified this was a guard, they took him back to Mauthausen. I said, what happened then? He said, prisoners picked up clubs and made a circle. And they made these guards walk through the circle. And as they walked through, each prisoner clubbed the guard till he was dead. I asked my father-in-law a question. And I said, can you tell me something? Did you participate? You have every right to participate. They killed your father. They killed your brother with his tefillin. You have every right to participate, did you? He said, no, I didn't. And then he said something which struck my heart in a very deep way. He said, most of those who did were not Jewish. There were non-Jewish prisoners in the camp as well. Most of those who took clubs and beat these Nazis to death were the non-Jews in the camp. He said, the Jews couldn't do it. Not because Jews are cowards, we aren't. Not because we're not great warriors or soldiers, we are. But the Jewish heart is different. The Jewish heart has traces of compassion and mercy. The Jewish heart can't just take a club and beat someone to death. Sometimes Hashem has to squeeze us to pull out from us who we really are. The Ramchal in Das Tavuna says that Hashem brings darkness into the world in order that we should work harder to show there's light. If anyone has any doubts that the Nazis were Hashem's darkness, it's interesting, you can think about it. The numerical value of Samkel, one of the names for the Satan, Samach Mem Aleph Lamed Samkel, Samkel. The gematria happens to be 131, the numerical value. Which is interesting because it's also the same numerical value as Eichmann. Eichmann was the chief executioner of Hitler. But it's even more interesting, by the way, if you spell out Samkel, you spell out the Samach, you spell out the Aleph, and you spell out the Chaf, and you spell out the Lamed, you get another gematria. You get the gematria of 254. I can't do the math for you here because I'm a board in front of me, but that happens to be the gematria of the name of Hitler. The job of the Satan is to squeeze us, to test us. And sometimes Hashem brings agents of darkness into this world to squeeze us and to test us to see what comes out. You know, anybody who studies in yeshivas today knows that one of the greatest yeshivas in Europe or in a place in Lithuania called Kovno. It's the place of the Kovno yeshiva, it's the place of the Slobodka yeshiva, my yeshiva. The Germans came into Kovno with one intention, to destroy the Rabbanim. And they succeeded very well. As part of the desire to destroy us, they wanted to keep a testimony to who we were. And they kept the library, Jewish books. And one Rav, Rabbi Ashroy, one of the great Talmid Chachamim of the time, was put as curator of the library. It was a library that would testify to the destruction of the Jewish people. Fortunately, he had access to sources, and people asked him questions, and he was able to answer. I'd like to share with you a few of the questions that was asked him. There's a volume we can get, 8 volumes called Mina Mamakim, with thousands of pages of responsa. Apparently he would write it up and hide it, and he found it after the war. In English you could find it in a book called Responsa from the Holocaust, which is an abbreviated version. Some of the questions that came to him. And let me ask you as I read these questions, are these questions of simple people? Or are these the questions of heroes? A man came to him. Actually, this was a question asked to the Kovno Rav. Man knocked on his door in the middle of the night and said, my son has been taken to the train station. Everyone understood that being taken to the train station meant being deported to a death camp. He said to the Kovno Rav, he said, I know the guard, and I can bribe the guard, and if I bribe him, I can get my son back. Am I allowed to? Because there's one problem. The Germans were so meticulous with numbers. If these said 500, they meant 500. And if they take one off, it means one has to go in. His question to the Kovner Rav was, am I allowed to get my son out if it means someone else's son has to go in? Kovner Rav turned to him, said, please do not ask me that question, I'm weak. To answer questions of life and death, you have to be in a strong state of mind. I haven't eaten, I'm not healthy, I'm not well. These are questions for me at the best of my abilities, not now. So this man said to him, I'm going to ask you again. Can I save my son if it means someone else's son has to go? Kovner Rav said, please do not ask me this question. So I'll ask you one more time. Can I save my son? Kovner Rav said, please don't ask me. This man turned to the Kovner Rav and he said, if you're not giving me a yes, I assume the answer is a no. I cannot save my son. He left the Kovner Rav's home. People saw him on the street. And they heard him whispering to himself. Hashem tested Avram with Rakedes Yitzchak. Will you give your son to God if you need to? Are you willing to sacrifice the life of your son? But at the last minute, God changed his mind. This man turned to Hashem and Hashem, I gave my son for you. Avram was only tested. I passed the test. I did it. Heroes? Simple people? Can resistance be something more than fighting back with machine guns? A cow was smuggled into the ghetto. People were starving, malnutrition. They had a question. We have shochtim, we could check this cow. We have people trained to investigate to see what's chaylev and what's not chaylev. Kosher fat and not kosher fat. We have people who can examine the lungs. We don't have to eat treif. We only have one problem. We don't have any salt. Because you don't salt the meat. The problem is blood is present, and to eat blood we know is a very serious sin, it's correct. So they went to Rav Ashroy and he proposed the following solution. We know it says in halacha that if you roast the meat, you can draw out all the blood. In fact, that's how you kash your liver. You probably know that. By roasting it over fire, it draws the blood out. You don't need salt. We can roast the meat and draw out the blood without salt. But there's only one problem with doing that. The starvation had so affected the people that their stomachs shrunk and they couldn't tolerate roasted meat. So the only way we could serve people in a way that's going to help them nutritionally is to boil the meat. So Rav Ashray suggested the following. Cut the meat up into very small pieces and cook it in a very large pot, so there will always be 60 times more water than meat. And therefore you'll always be able to nullify the blood 60 to 1. Beautiful solution. And that's what they did. And it took a lot of time to cut the meat up very small and to cook very small amounts of meat with a large amount of water. So there will always be that nullification of 60 to 1. Batal b'shisha. My friends, starving people? Finally there's a cow? And there's a question of how are we going to eat this? Not just to eat it, but how are we going to eat it to fulfill the halacha to the best of our ability? You squeeze a Jew, what comes out? Is that sheep to the slaughter, as people want to say? Is that victims? Are those heroes? I suggest those are heroes. Rav Gershon Weiss wrote a beautiful sefer about his experience in concentration camps. He survived the war, He was learning at Ner Yisrael. And in Ner Yisrael, one of his roommates asked him the questions in the 1950s, how did you keep your faith after what you saw? He said, I never lost my faith. And the reason I kept it is for the following. One time I was in the camp, and a Nazi guard burst into our barrack and said, there's been sabotage, and unless we find the saboteur, we're going to kill everybody in this barrack. A hammer was missing. If a hammer was missing, that was considered to be sabotage against the Third Reich. And this guard said, unless somebody confesses to having stolen this hammer, I'm going to hang everybody here. So one little Jew stepped forward. 17 years old. Skinny. And he said to this Nazi guard, he said, I stole the hammer. And this Nazi looked at him and said, I don't believe you. You're a skinny little Jew. Little runt of a person. I don't believe you stole it. And this little Jew was a teenager. He said, my father's a rabbi. He said, my grandfather is a rabbi. I grew up in a family where we were trained not to lie. And I demand on your German honor that you keep your commitment. You said whoever confesses will be killed and the rest will live. This German officer couldn't do anything about it. He took this Jew out and he hung him. Later in the bunk, the barrack that night, the rest of the Jews were sitting and talking about this event. And he said, does a Jew have a right to do that? Is a Jew allowed to sacrifice his life to save other Jews? And they concluded by saying, he wasn't a Jew. He was an angel. And Rabbi Weiss said, when I saw that, I understood what a Jew is. A Jew is an angel. I never lost my faith. Sometimes, my friends, the Ribono Shel Olam needs to squeeze out from us who we are. In the most dire straits, under the most severe situation and circumstances. And I suggest to you that the heroism of the Holocaust was a heroism beyond anything we can imagine. It wasn't the resistance of guns, with guns, although there were times, but the resistance of angels. A resistance of Jews living to live for each other and give to each other and die for each other. And to ask questions to keep the halacha while they're starving. That's the heroism of the Holocaust. That's the legacy that we take with us. And that's the realization we have to appreciate as to who and what you and I and all of us and all the Jewish people really are.